Hello, welcome to our second live session to answer your questions and requesting you to participate in a discussion on our course Marketing Management 1. We have interacted for last 8 weeks on this topic. We have received many questions on the forum time to time, and in the last few days you have posted many questions where you have doubts. Today, this live session is going to you direct on the internet through the Hangout. Also, we are recording it, so it will be available as a normal recorded lecture on the or a session on our course website. So if you're not able to access, or if you get cut off due to bandwidth problem from the live connection, then don't worry, you will be able to see the whole thing and participate in the conversation later on through the course website. So we have received 3 types of questions. Some questions are more of administrative nature, relating to certificate, examination date, assignments, grades, and so on. Those we will answer individually or through the forum. But today's session will be dedicated to subject matter questions. So questions on different aspects of marketing will be taken up. We took up few of those in the last session. Today I will start with this question, which has come from quite a few persons, that what is the role of marketing research in new product development? This is a very interesting question. Now we'll divide this in 2 parts. If it is a B2B product, industrial product, business to business marketing product, then as you know, the demand for a B2B product is always a derived demand. So maybe Maruti is going in for a new model. They will need a new kind of steering system or window regulator or lamps. So the demand for the new types of lights or the new type of window regulator and the design requirements will depend on the design of the main car, and the demand will depend on the demand of the car. So because it is a derived demand, in market research for a new B2B product, you have to focus on your major customers, and on the basis of the inputs that you receive from them on market conditions or on their plans or on their design, you come to conclusions, and those become your market research findings. But in case of a normal consumer product, B2C product, we have market research of two types. Remember, we are discussing about market research for a new product. So if it is a sort of incrementally new, that means it is similar to the products, so it is similar to the mobile phones that are available now in the market. You are doing the market research for a phone with, say, an added display feature or an added projection feature, or for example a feature where some Microsoft phones have now come with this feature that you can do your document editing, etc., from the phone, plug to a bigger screen and so on. So the phone almost behaves like a normal Windows computer. Now this kind of incremental change, what will be the market size due to this incremental facility, that can be derived from the trend of sales of similar mobile phones. But if it is radically different, if it is a truly new product, then the market research has to be both qualitative and quantitative. Incidentally, I am in this part of the question, I am also responding to another good question that we had received, that what is the difference, or I think the question was that yes, what is the difference between qualitative and quantitative market research? So qualitative market research, like focus group discussions or like long-term observation of the consumers, or participating in the consumption activity along with some consumers, kind of an action research, are all very good methods when we don't know, or rather the customer doesn't know about the features, capabilities, properties, attributes of this new product. So it is a radically new product, not known before. So like for example, if you go back to those days when there was nothing like a tablet or pad, so there was phone and there was desktop, or there was phone and laptop. And then there is this new device which is bigger than a phone, much bigger than a phone, smaller than a laptop, and with different kind of functionalities and working on an Android type of or iOS type of phone operating system as opposed to a computer operating system, and working with solid state memory and no disk or anything. Now the format, the capabilities, the value proposition were all quite new, significantly different. In this case, the qualitative methods like observation, so you provide some of these as probes and see how the consumer tries to use it. Or in case of certain products, you can use candid camera with, or you can use long duration observation, ethnographic study, the consumer interacting with the product. In this kind of scenario, this observation study, even when we do focus group discussion, that means we invite customers of that type, our target type, and we have a group, and we also have some control groups. and then we discuss with them this product, show them prototypes, or maybe show them a working product, and then have a discussion. In this, there is a sort of, one can suggest a loose or flexible structure which can be called EDIPT. E means explore for developing empathy. So this empathy part is very important in this qualitative market research. So empathy is your ability to put yourself in the shoes of the customer. So you try to see from customer's eyes, from their perspective, from the gains that you are offering in terms of the pains suffered by the customer in doing a certain task with the currently available products or solutions. So with empathy, you try to explore that what can this product do, what this product should do, what is the task that the customer wants to perform, and what kind of facilities he or she is looking for. The next part, the D, is kind of discovery mode for understanding some of the design outlines. And I is a stage where actually you do ideation, you discuss your ideas with the customer, you discuss the ideas with your team members who may be involved with the customer in a sort of a co-creation mode. So look at the idea from different competencies, from different perspectives. And then you try to come up with some kind of interpretation. And based on that, we do a very interesting stage, which is normally not done in a usual market research, but here in this sort of qualitative market research based on design thinking, we can then do some prototyping. The prototyping can even be just, some sketches, some drawings, and some paper folded, some, stuff cut with scissors, glue, and create a sort of three-dimensional view of what we're trying to do.
Right.
So, at the least, it should be something what we call protocepting. That means it is based on discussion on what it will do, what it will look like, what it will feel. And prototyping means you try to create a mock-up using available material like cardboard, foam, paper, and so on. Now, then of course comes this testing part, interacting with the consumer. Now what happens is, in this kind of research, we get a feel of what that product is, what it will do, right? How it will take care of customers' pains and what kind of gains it will offer, etc. Then the next stage in doing the qualitative, or I would say this is something that is positioned between the qualitative and quantitative, is to ask some of the W and H questions, meaning who will buy this product? Why? Why will anybody buy this product? So who means which is the target customer group? Why means what is the rationale? What kind of pain this product will solve, etc. And then we should ask that why will they buy from us? This is where our competencies, our differentiation, because a similar product, like for a mobile phone with camera, many companies were working at the same time. So in their own exercises, they had to always answer this question that, okay, who will buy, why will they buy, but why will they buy from us? These are very simple questions. But if we answer these questions, and will they continue to buy from us? Will they refer our product to others?
Right.
This will tell us the size, because once you know that, okay, this product, who will buy this product? This product is a specially designed laptop. This product is a specially designed mobile phone meant for young professional women, right? Once we say that who will buy this product and why they will buy this product, we can then easily create from the different types of databases that are available publicly, we can create a certain reliably
Estimated market size.
testable market size.
Right.
That, okay, 25 to 35 age group professional women in Bombay or in Delhi. We can get from the census data and other data some size of this market, right? Once we have that, then you see it is possible for us to go to the next stage, which is more quantitative market research. Because then we can say, okay, this is the total market that can be addressed.
Right.
And then we say, okay, this is the size of this 25 to 35 young lady professional market in Bombay, Bangalore, Delhi, Calcutta, all put together. This is the size is X. Of X, I first decide that I am going to launch it in Bombay. So I can then take to the next, that is the market I am addressing. So one is the total addressable market and the second is the market that I am addressing, right? Or want to address. That size once we know, then we have this very interesting model, what we call ATAR. That means A stands for number of people who are aware of our product. T stands for people who have had an opportunity to look at our product, touch our product, have participated in some kind of trial, whether it is in a mall when someday we had a demonstration, or we participated in an exhibition and showed this product and people came and played with the product. So if therefore say 100,000 people are aware, they have been touched by our mailing campaign or on our social media campaign, these are the number of people who have put likes. So 100,000 people are aware. We then take a subsection of these people. We say, okay, maybe 30% people had an opportunity to try of this 100,000. Okay, then we multiply therefore by 0.3. This original possible market of 100,000, which we can call A, then we A multiplied by the people, percentage of people who have tried.
We've tried.
Okay, A into T. Then we say, okay, 30,000 people have tried, but my initial distribution strategy is such that maybe half of these people will find the product readily available. Okay, then we multiply that by the second A, ATA. And then comes R, right? So in that R will be the people who we will think about repurchase, etc. Even if we ignore that, if we just take ATA, that gives us a nice estimate of what can be the market size of a new product, which has been first conceived through the design thinking, which is that EDIPT model that I talked about. And then we apply this we answer those questions, that who will buy our product, why will they buy our product, why will they buy from us. From that, we give some sort of contour to our target market. Once we know that, then we can define the A. That means the market size that is aware of our product or offering. Then we can multiply that by T, the number of people who have had an opportunity to try it out, and then we can multiply that by a percentage factor to indicate availability, our distribution strategy, and that will give us the ability to take to the next stage, which is the quantitative stage. In the traditional quantitative stage, we can, frame questions, decide on a sample size depending on the total population that we want to address, structure the questionnaire properly, and then we can find out through the quantitative methods that how do we compare with other products, and from that we can conclude that what percentage of the target population are likely to buy our product. So then we can go to a quantitative market. I would request you, Somnath, to take up some of the more crucial issues here when we do this market research, like for example scaling, etc. Also, when we have data available for similar product, sale of similar products, then how we can do quantitative forecasting. These two topics, then you can take it up.
Right.
Okay. So we will take a little pause here, and we'll come back after we set up our PowerPoints. Yeah,
So,
I can see them, but
right, yeah.
can you hear me? Karthikeya? Akshata, can you hear me?
No. Yes.
Hello, yes, sir.
Yeah, you have a question?
Hello.
Do you have a question?
Sir, I wanted to ask, I was thinking of, for social entrepreneurship, how is marketing, what kind of marketing model could be used?
Okay. You see, I would like to segregate this issue about social entrepreneurship, because our course is on marketing. So let us say that if you have a socially relevant product or artifact which you want to market, or you want a social service where you want to enlist people to participate. Let's take that sort of an example. So this sort of marketing is, in certain sense, easier, because you are not marketing a product or a service, you are actually marketing a cause.
Yeah.
And people respond to causes better than to commercial propositions. So if you are actually doing a marketing, say for raising funds for setting up a school, a series of schools or a chain of schools for villages, for village girls, for example, that is one kind of where actually the cause is very tangible. Or you can be just marketing an idea, like the Swachh Bharat, or say toilets in villages. So this that is an idea which you want to market. So here, the normal marketing rules will apply almost. Here there is no apparently no price because people are not actually paying because you are just transmitting an idea. But in reality, the exchange, the fundamental axiom of marketing, that consumer is actually giving you attention, that consumer is actually giving you time, that consumer is actually going to later on respond to you in some way. So even if there is no money transaction involved, there is certain other some resources in the command of the consumer, like time, like effort, like a vote, or like propagating to others. So there is something that the customer is giving in exchange of what you are proposing to the customer. So that exchange works. But here, of course, in that sense, you have a cause, and the customer responds to the cause. So the emotional part of the marketing appeal is stronger in such cases. There is a greater amount of trust in this kind of exchange. But the important point is, because there is no consumption of the material nature, there is no profit motive of the material nature involved in this equation. So there's, from the seller side, it is not exactly profit oriented. You may even Ramakrishna Mission have to generate surplus, because otherwise they don't have the resources to grow. But they don't take it as a dividend and take it home. They redeploy the surplus in the organization. But in some cases, you may be doing it without any motive of generating wealth for yourself, which will be appreciated by the consumer. So Ramakrishna Mission's appeal, or any other such voluntary organization, when they appeal for a social service and try to raise donation, then the initial response is usually better than a normal marketing approach for selling a goods or service. But in the long run, what the customer is getting from this has to be, some clarity has to be there, that what is it that you are offering in exchange to the consumer. There will be some form of moral, intellectual, emotional return that will have to be there. Some feel-good factor will have to be there to make this sort of marketing successful. So it's a long subject of doing this marketing for not-for-profit organizations, or marketing for non-corporate organizations. But fundamentally, there are many issues involved. Fundamentally, the basic model of exchange, that means you have something, you have a proposition, and the consumer has a return payment of a certain type involved here as well. Only thing is, here it is not a payment in kind. It is a payment, it is not payment in money, but it is a payment in kind, by way of time, attention, and so on. On the other hand, you are not actually offering in exchange a product or a service, but you may be offering certain kind of emotional, intellectual, spiritual satisfaction, or feeling good. And you'll have to therefore craft your value proposition carefully. What is it that you are bringing in the exchange? And what is the customer, you want the customer to bring as exchange, then your marketing strategy will become clearer.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay. All right. We will now take up some other questions where we may have to show you some diagrams. So Shomnath will now take up 2 or 3 important issues in that respect. So now we are going off from the internet. This part of the program you will be able to see on our course website.
Hello all. Today we will be discussing a little bit about the different forecasting techniques that we have and also something about the scaling techniques as asked in the forum. Forecasting techniques are broadly of 2 types, qualitative and quantitative. So for qualitative, what we use is not data per se, but we use the judgment and opinions of expert people. One of the examples is that of the Delphi method. We will come to the details later of that. For quantitative methods, we use the forecast based on the past data. This method is rather used for products that have a long history of sales, that is not for a new product but for an existing product. One of the major assumptions of this quantitative technique is that the sales pattern in the future will be similar to the sales pattern of the past. The techniques used are moving averages, exponential smoothing. Let us discuss about the Delphi method first. In the Delphi method, as can be seen, what is done is a team of experts are gathered in a room and they are asked to forecast a certain number about sales of a certain product with an explanation that why did they come up with that particular number. The moderator of the discussion then circulates this number and the reason for this particular number among all the moderators. So then they are asked, all the participants. The participants then modify the data based on the reasoning they have received from others and the data that they have received from others. This goes on several times, that is there are several iterations, and finally they come up with what can be termed as an expert opinion of the probable sales figure. One of the major benefits of this sort of a method is the anonymity of participants. Since nobody knows that who made which particular remark or which particular figure, this judgment or this number that they produce is basically devoid of any sort of bias. Next we move on to the quantitative methods. One of the most used quantitative methods, which is also very easy to use by the way, is that of the moving averages. What we do in moving averages, say we want to find out what is the probable number of sales for the month of March. So what we will do is we will take up the sales figures for the past 3 months, divide it by 3, and we will say, okay, this is the probable sales figure for the month of March. Since this 3 months is just as an example, this can be for the past 3 months, past 4 months, past 6 months, and you can take any duration that you are comfortable with or which matches with the actual sales performance of the company. One better way of doing this moving averages is to attach a weight to the sales data. It can be seen that the newer data might have a bigger impact while the older data may have a smaller impact. So to adjust for those fluctuations, what we do is we attach certain weights to the sales figures. That is, for the absolutely last sales figure of the 3rd month, we attach a minimal weight of 0.08. And then we distribute the remaining weights, that is 0.92, among the last 2 months. One thing to be noticed here is the sum of the weights for this weighted moving average will always be equal to 1. Next we come to the question of exponential smoothing. Exponential smoothing
So
is...
which means that suppose we have last 6 months the data is like say 20,000, then 15,000, then 10,000, then 8, 9, 7,000,
Right.
then because it shows a generally declining trend. So by using this weighted moving average, we'll give a higher weight to the recent data.
Right. Exactly.
The later months data.
Later months data.
As opposed to the much earlier data.
Earlier data. Because what we are trying to do here is we are trying to remove the bias for the earlier data. That is, maybe for some reason 6 months back we have a very high sale. but probably down the line we will not be having such a high sale. So in order to remove that particular bias of that high volume of data from the calculation, we attach a higher weight to the newer data. It may so happen because of performance of company, they may think that okay fine, they'll have a better sale, so they attach some higher weight to the old data as well. So this is basically a judgmental decision that are carried out by sales experts, that what should exactly be the weight and to which part of the sales they should attach what kind of a weight.
Sure.
So next we come to the question of exponential smoothing. In exponential smoothing, there is a factor called alpha. So what it does is, in a normal basic exponential smoothing, we basically take last 2 months sales. We say that fine, it's a form of weighted average, where we say for the last month sale the weight will be alpha, and for the next month prior month sale before the last month, it will be 1 minus alpha. So why this is called exponential smoothing? This is called exponential smoothing since if we replace the figures of t minus 1 using this formula again and again, we will get an exponential series, which consists of 1 plus x square by 2 factorial plus x cube by 3 factorial and so on and so forth. So this is why this method has been termed as basic exponential smoothing. There are several iterations or modifications of this basic exponential smoothing, like second order or second degree exponential smoothing, which focuses on trends. So what we do is in a second order exponential smoothing is that we calculate a probable figure for sales, then we calculate a trend, and then we adjust the calculated figure of sales with the trend factor.
But in principle, it is almost similar to the weighted moving average.
In principle, it's
because we are giving higher importance to the more recent
sales figures.
Figures.
Right. So there are again variations, as I was saying. There is a third degree exponential smoothing which again takes in more complications, but these are used by very advanced firms and where there is a lot of data available to actually do this sort of things and verify things. Another approach that is taken is that of econometric or causal methods. So what we do in there is, instead of identifying what will be the sales based on past data, we try to identify what are the factors that influence the sales. Say for example, the amount of sales I have will depend on the number of outlets I have, will depend on the, say probably the season of the time, whether it's Christmas or Diwali. So based on these factors, we come up with models. This method is known as econometric and causal methods. Usually we go for multivariate regression and so other methods. As Sir was discussing the ATAR model, this is just an example of this ATAR model. The ATAR model stands for awareness, trial, availability, and repeat or referral. So what happens
There is a spelling mistake here. It should be TRIAL.
Yeah, it's trial. So what happens is, say I have a market of size 1 million, out of which I am saying due to my promotional activities or advertising, 50% becomes aware. Out of those 50%, 60% decide to try out that product. Out of that 60%, 50% are able to find that product due to our supply chain constraints and distribution efforts. And of them, 60% decides to buy that product again after using it once. So for that, we come to a fraction of the market size. That is, we say that 0.09% of the market will actually use this product. So if we know the total market size, we can come up with a basic rough estimate regarding the sales that we can expect for a new product. So next we come to this concept of scaling. Whenever the concept of scaling is related to that of measuring something. When we are doing market research or when we are trying to generate some insight from the market, we have to measure some data, and to measure this, we use several levels of data. Now, what are those levels? They are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. In nominal level, we basically categorize the data. Say, for example, we are categorizing the data in terms of male and female, or married or unmarried. So this is a way of segregating data only on the basis of labels with no numerical significance attached. Next comes the ordinal part. In ordinal part, there is a significance attached. Say I know X is better than Y, but I cannot say by how much X is better than Y. There is just a level which gives that something is better or something is worse compared to the other. In interval level, we actually, these methods, One thing to be said here is that these data measurements are used for statistical analysis, and each of them will have their own statistical significance. That is, the type of operations that we can do on ordinal data cannot be done on nominal data, and so on and so forth. So for interval part, we are saying that, okay, we know that x is better than y. We also know that by how much x is better than y. That part is given in the interval data. Ratio data is one where there is a fixed defined 0 for the different data points. So next we come to the question of scaling. Once we have measured, when we are trying to measure this, we have to use a scale to measure the data. One of the types of scaling is that of comparative scale. One of the examples of comparative scale is that of paired comparison. Suppose a company is trying to find out that why does the customers do not buy their product. Say because it's expensive, or because it's not easily available, or because the product has an odd design. So what we do is we try to come up with sets of questionnaires, all possible sets. Say for example, A and B, A and C, B and C. Then we do a sort of a survey, say out of 20 people that the data is taken here. Then we ask them that between A and B, which is worse? So they give some response. Between C and B, which is worse, they give some response. And between A and C, which is worse, they give some response. Here it's like, we can interpret this table as 15 people said that B is a more negative feature than A. That is, not easily available hampers their chance of buying more than the product being expensive. So in this way, we can see that for feature B, people have attached a higher weight. That is, more people have said that B is a worse feature among these three components, because the number of respondents who have said B is worse as compared to A and C is very high. So in this way, by using paired comparison of different factors, we may come up with a rank of factors that the consumer weighs or that the consumer uses in his decision making. The next part is the non-comparative scale. In non-comparative scale, we try to measure one factor and the level of that factor. Say there are several methods of non-comparative scale, one of them being the continuous rating scale. In continuous rating scale, there is a origin and there will be some end, and there are in-between points in which you can attach your rating. That is, there is a 0 and there is a 100, where 0 stands for favorable and 100 stands for 0 stands for unfavorable and 100 stands for favorable. And in between 0 and 100, there are various levels. That is, 10 is slightly less unfavorable than 0, 20 is slightly less unfavorable than 10, and so on and so forth. In semantic scale, instead of giving numeric weights, we go for subjective weights. That is, we say that there is one good and bad, which are the origin and endpoints, and then we divide them into subjective endpoints, such as quite, slightly, it's like extremely good, quite good, slightly good, neither good, not bad, slightly bad, and so on and so forth. In a semantic differential scale, what we do is we give the endpoint and the origin, but in between we do not give anything. It's like there are two bipolar words. Say here it's important, here it's unimportant. So there are two bipolar words, and we try to see the ranking of the consumer on the basis of these two words only. One of the most used scales in market research is that of a Likert scale, wherein there are usually 5 to 7 factors, and these factors are termed as strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. These are usually the responses to survey questions, whether you agree to a certain point, whether you disagree to a certain point. And using this, we measure what is the response of the survey. So this is it in terms of scaling.
Right.
And,
So today, therefore, we have discussed some of your questions with respect to qualitative market research, quantitative market research, and we have discussed some of the specific techniques like scaling or different types of forecasting when we have sufficient data available, different types of forecasting when we do not have sufficient data available, and we hope that these will form a good supplement to your studies in response to our earlier sessions. Thank you very much, and all the best for the coming examination. Bye.